Hello, fellow explorers. Thanks for spending a few moments with me so that I can share with you some of the current themes that we're experiencing collectively at this time. We know that the last few months has been pretty intense insofar as personal triggers for fear, anxiety, issues that we thought we put to rest in the past are coming up. And it's important time to know that for many people who are quite conscious already, it's very easy to reference and to feel a lot of these experiences as your own personal experiences, but in essence we're becoming more and more like the barometers for what's happening in the collective field. So especially if you're feeling it when you wake up in the morning, or if you're just getting a general sense of unease or feeling a little bit out of balance, it's always good to ask yourself the question, what am I sensing today? What can I sense rather than what is it that I feel? Because when we say, what is it that I feel, it's so easy to internalize it into our own personal experience, reference it to our own memory systems. And when we do that, we tend to circle around and turn it into a problem that needs to be solved. It becomes very encapsulated in our field. So one of the little things I've been doing every day is when I wake up and when I'm feeling into my body and, oh gosh, I've got a lot to do today, or I wonder what's ahead, I'm really saying to myself, what is it that I sense? So I'm actually asking myself, what is the vibrational weather today? And it's been such a helpful thing for me personally, because that way it's not about what I need to repair or fix. It's more about, oh, this is the current climate. And when I know that, I can then make a conscious choice to say, well, I'm going to feel this despite that. So I may sense that there's a thunderstorm outside, or that there's a lot of rain or depression or anxiety or whatever it is, tumultuous energy, but I'm going to feel warm and cozy and safe and relaxed and open-hearted. So the distinction there between I sense and I feel, for me at least, the semantics of that has been incredibly helpful in recent weeks. So that's the first thing I wanted to share. The second thing I wanted to talk about today is what's happening with data and information storage within our fields. Because the more open-ended our nervous system becomes, there's a big nervous system calibration right now, the more we're feeling into that collective, which is what we've just mentioned to you. But when that happens, we start to become very, very aware of the density and the weight of data and information as we have been storing it. Because our memory systems have been, in essence, storing information. And one of the interesting things that the masters shared in a recent seminar was that thought and a thought form, thoughts become crystallized and thoughts take shape, all of these words that we use to describe thought. A thought form actually has mass, because anything that becomes something that's identifiable as form actually has a vibrational mass to it. It has weight in our third and fourth dimensional reality. So every time we have thoughts or we absorb information, if that information or data comes through a thought or comes through a thought process, or it comes from an externalized source of reference, we actually absorb that. And it's how we're taught oftentimes to learn things from a young age through the education system. I'm going to absorb and memorize that information. Well, to have that data absorption occur, we actually need to take on that thought form and mass into our vibrational field. So in essence, the more information and data that we actually absorb from an external source as a thought in a relational way, the more mass we have. So part of the premise for third and fourth dimensional reality is that we look to become learned, we look to become wise, we look to fill ourselves up with information and experience. We're accumulators. But in doing so, we actually become more solid. We actually become more physically bound. We actually become more anchored in to the grid of third dimensional reality. Now, when I first heard this, I thought it was so interesting, because it helped me understand why, when I went through really intense periods of study or learning, perhaps doing a new course, or when I was at university or going through school, I always felt really weighted. And I felt many times that the information didn't really make me feel liberated or free. It just made me feel more kind of anchored into a particular point of view or a particular way of seeing. So that for me made a lot of sense. And I have to say that the more I went through my own spiritual experience and my own awakening, and particularly when I began to channel, one of the things that I noticed was that I would have periods of memory loss where I couldn't remember small details. I found it more difficult to study. I actually left university for a while when this opening happened for me. I came back to it eventually, but in a new way. And I found that short-term memory loss, sometimes long-term memory loss, was a really common thing for me. And it's something I hear from people all over the world who are going through awakening experiences, and they get very concerned. If I had $1 for every person that contacted me and said, I think I have early onset of Alzheimer's or dementia, I would probably be retired somewhere. So it's very, very common, because what happens is that the more refined our energy system becomes, the more vibrationally fine we become, the less data storage we have. So we actually have to let go of the accumulation sense of who we are in order to actually elevate beyond the containment of third dimensional reality. So in other words, to become more aware of ourselves as essence, as source consciousness, as multidimensionality, we have to be able to move beyond that weight of awareness of our third dimensionality. So memory loss is one of those things that we experience as we start to awaken. Now, the other thing that happens too is, for many people, is that they experience, when they're weighed down by how much information they're having to absorb, how much they're having to take on from the exterior environment, we often carry more body weight and more mass as well. So there's a sense of heaviness, and sometimes that looks physical, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it feels emotional, that there's emotional heaviness. So in order to really lighten the load, it's important to understand that we're not actually designed as humans to be storage devices. And I actually really loved it when the masters described this to us in a recent seminar. They said, well, humanity is not actually designed to store information. Humanity is actually designed to express possibility and then play with it and experiment with it and see what it does. And they told a story about these legends, or the mythology that actually exists in many different cultures around the world, around gods that became stone idols. And I thought this was really fascinating, because they used this example to show us how humanity in the beginning were incredibly light, multi-dimensional beings. And we, in essence, over time, became more and more and more and more and more dense, with all of the data storage, the absorption of information instead of the expression of information and innate wisdom. And eventually, the living gods became stone gods and became very dense in form. Now, what do we know about a stone god? Well, a stone god can be worshipped, can become an idol, but it's only really a representation of the potential of that god itself. What we also know about a stone god is that it's often fixed in one position, and once it's fixed, it's very difficult to move it. So I found that super interesting, because often the way that we intend to move through life is to become as skilled and learned as possible, so that we can become more stable and secure. And instead, what tends to happen is that we become very fixed. And the more fixed we become with all of this absorption and storage of information, the less sense of natural freedom, spontaneity, and innate wisdom and responses to situations we experience. So I feel that humanity at this time is going through this huge expansion of vibration and consciousness. Part of that is no longer investing in and worshipping the storage of information, but rather allowing that to become released, stepping into more and more into the space of, I don't really know, or the void space, because we're meant to be portals, we're meant to be the emptiness from which source expresses, like a wellspring. And it's difficult to do that when you're so saturated with information that comes from somewhere else. So the more vibrationally refined we become, the more we're naturally going to be lightening the load in terms of the data that we have contained within ourselves, and the more we're going to be able to become conduits, expressions, and representations of the source wisdom that's truly available through us. So another thing that happens there, of course, is that when we start to lose memory for things and facts and data, we can also start to lose emotional memory. And this is fantastic, because what this means is that we're no longer using our memory system to cue us into what to think and feel. So, of course, as the collective humanity is going through this lightening of the load right now, what can we expect? We can expect that out there in the weather, there is an awful lot of data floating around that's being released from the human storage facilities that we've been. It's floating around in the collective field, and it's super intense. It's like everything's just been released. That's trauma, that's memory about things, that's facts. There's so much argument going on at this time. There's so much debate. There's so much trauma and pain and fear from the past, because all of that's getting released right now. So it's super stormy out there. So that's why we began the conversation by saying, well, what do I sense rather than what it is that I feel? Because the more that you actually begin to release the mass and the accumulation of these thought forms and this data, the more you can actually start to know what it is that you feel. Because up until this point, we haven't really been able to know what it is to feel, because what we've been feeling is all of the data that's been stored within us. So if you're in a space of I don't know, it's a sure sign, or I don't know what to feel, I don't know what's going on, it's a sure sign that that clearing is starting to happen for you. And then you can start to sit in that space of, well, what's sitting underneath that? What do I really feel in there? Can I actually feel what it feels like to be me? So we are going to do another video on what's happening within the reptilian brain while this is all happening as well, because that's cueing a lot of the physiological experiences at this time, but that's going to be another conversation. In the meantime, I hope that that's been helpful for you. It's certainly something many of us are experiencing at this time, and perhaps this story that the Masters offered about the stone gods and the living gods can remind us of who we truly are as a species. I hope you have a beautiful month, and I'll speak to you again soon.